Here's the Marietta Declaration, signed by me. Really appreciate the stand that y'all are taking.
Thank you so much.
The only thing, and my son Derek here knows that it's hard for me to even sign a document without editing. The only one word that I would change, where it's still open to edits or biographing it, in the second whereas clause, it says, whereas Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution vests the executive power of the President of the United States, and Article 2, Section 3 grants the President the power to faithfully execute or carry out the laws passed by Congress. I think that really what we talk about when we try and analyze and evaluate the actions of the President, it's important. We went through this with the impeachment of Bill Clinton. It isn't that the President has the power in the Constitution to see that the laws be faithfully executed. It is a responsibility. And there's a very important difference there. When a president takes an oath of office to the Constitution, unlike a lot of folks in Washington, that Constitution has no perforations in it. Some people, a lot of people, in fact, in Washington like to use the Constitution sort of like a coupon book, where it has around each phrase or each section, sometimes around each word, they think that there are perforations, so if they want to do something, by taking a provision in the Constitution out of context, they can just neatly, through those perforations, just sort of tear the phrase out, or a partial section or phrase in the Constitution, and wave that around. Well, the Constitution isn't made that way. There are responsibilities that are laid out in the Constitution, and when a president fails to carry out those responsibilities, and he does so in a way that is violative of the laws or the Constitution or the intent and letter thereof, then I believe we have a corresponding responsibility to hold him accountable. And that's what we did with President Clinton. And as Barry was saying at the program we had the other night, and by the way, if Barry thinks that those are debates, or being in a forum with 6 candidates and getting 1 minute to answer questions, he would have a rude awakening in the Congress of the United States. You don't get a single thing done in the Congress of the United States and the House of Representatives by just pontificating for a minute about something. You have to be relentless in knowing the rules of the House, knowing the rules of the committees, knowing the powers, knowing the legislation, knowing the people in the executive branch, knowing the committee and the subcommittee jurisdiction and concurrent jurisdiction and subsequent jurisdiction. You got to know that stuff. And you have to be willing, as I was in the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee for the few years that I had the dubious pleasure of working opposite Chuck Schumer when he was in the House. You don't best Chuck Schumer in a debate by simply saying something, speaking for a minute, and then let somebody else speak. And those aren't debates. And that's not how you get things done in the real world. You have to be relentless in going after these people day after day after day, and hold their feet to the fire, and not do what so many people up in Washington do. Republicans and Democrats alike, but particularly Republicans, don't seem to have the backbone to really fight, go mano a mano, toe to toe, eye to eye, fist to fist with these folks up there. Time and time again, for example, if you watch, as all of us probably have, almost certainly have, if you watch congressional hearings and you see these folks come up to the Hill, they've been requested to come up sometimes by subpoena if they won't come voluntarily, and they'll sit there and they'll sweat for a half a day, take out a handkerchief and wipe their brow, and they'll sweat and they'll fidget and so forth and ask their staffs for the answers and go like this and talk with their lawyer and so forth. But inside, they're really laughing at the Congress because they know that the vast majority of members of Congress view the debate process and view the process up there like Barry does. But it's much, much harder than that. What these folks know is the chances are, as long as they can just slough through that, that uncomfortable half a day or sometimes an entire day before a committee and get beat up on by everybody on that committee or subcommittee, giving them a soundbite, getting their 5 minutes of fame on C-SPAN or whatever, they know that the vast majority of people in the Congress have neither the knowledge, the experience, or the stick-to-itiveness to hold their feet to the fire after the lights go out on that committee hearing. That's where the real work gets done. And you have to be tough enough and consistent enough and choose your issues wisely enough to go after them day after day after day and not let them skate away from it. That's the real world up there. And that's the real world in which, if we hope to accomplish any of what you all stand for, the Tea Party, the Georgia Tea Party, promoting individual liberty and limited government, it has very little to do with a lot of theory. It's based on very, very fundamental, important principles of governance handed down to us as free men by our true founder, the Lord, and codified in the Constitution, which is, as Mr. Madison, one of the most important students of and teachers of the Constitution, said in one of the Federalist Papers, it's a constitutional road. That's what this is. It's a roadmap. And you have to know how to negotiate it. Otherwise, all the theories in the world, all the highfalutin one-minute sound bites, all the so-called forums that some people think are debates, doesn't mean anything. You have to know how to take the Constitution and these important goals of the Georgia Tea Party and other groups that all of us work with and translate them into real policies. That's the hard work. And that's the work that we need to accomplish in the Congress. Barry says, well, the only way to accomplish a balanced budget is a constitutional amendment. Absolutely not true. Demonstrably not true. Factually not true. When I was part of the majority that went up to the House of Representatives for the first time in 1994, our budget was way out of balance. Not as much as it is now. So it's even worse now, but it was out of balance by significant billions of dollars, trillions of dollars back then. And there were folks, even within our own party, who said, well, at best, y'all will be able to balance the budget within 10 years. And there were a lot of people, even among our own caucus, that thought that. And there were other folks like Barry that think, well, the only way we can do it is a constitutional amendment. Now, that is one way to do it. No doubt about it. But within 2.5 years of taking the majority of the House in the 1994 election and being sworn into office as the first Republican majority in 40 years in January of 1995, within 2.5 years, we had a balanced budget. And we did it notwithstanding the fact that we did not have at that time, and I don't think we have now either, the supermajority to amend the Constitution to require a balanced budget. You don't need a constitutional amendment to do it. It's great if we have it. Although many of the versions that we've seen up there have so many loopholes in them that it really, in practice, would be a little different from the situation we have now. The only way we have a balanced budget is to do what we did when we had the majority back in the mid and late 1990s. Use the power that is already vested in the House and have leadership and members who keep their eye not on the short term but on the long term. The short term being a particular continuing resolution. And here again, a continuing resolution does not give a president a blank check. That shows an ignorance of what a continuing resolution is. A continuing resolution is simply a legislative vehicle that the Congress passes that continues to fund all of those programs that are included in it And it could be for the whole range of government programs, or it could be only for those affecting 3 or 4 or one particular department. It's usually used when the two houses of the Congress can't agree on a final appropriations number. So they pass what's called a continuing resolution. It doesn't grant the president a blank check. What it does is simply continues funding at the same level as the previous year. That's what it does. Now, it doesn't shrink spending, which is what we really need to be doing, but it's not a blank check for anything. It's simply, by its very nature, by its very term, a continuing resolution. It simply continues the funding. But what we were able to do back in the day, when we had real leadership and a committed majority in the House, is we did not allow a single spending bill that the president, Bill Clinton at the time, wanted and was pushing for to come to the floor of the House for a vote. We refused to allow him to define the playing field. Now, does that mean we got everything we wanted? Absolutely not. We have separation of powers. We have 2 houses of the Congress, the way our system currently is. We have 2 parties in each of those 2 houses. We have the president. So you have to figure out a way to sort of negotiate that obstacle field. But what we did, and what we need to continue to do, and do again in the House with the majority that I have every confidence we will have going into the 114th Congress next January, and I think there's a good chance, knock on wood, that we'll have a majority in the Senate. Not a 60-vote majority. I mean, that would be great, but I don't see those numbers shaping up. But a majority in the Senate. What it does, when you use the power already vested in the House, in the Constitution, in the rules of the House, in the Budget Control Act of 1974, you force a stubborn, spendthrift president to the negotiating table. You do not allow his spending measures to come to the floor. You allow only those that in this case, we in the Republican majority in the House wished and believed were necessary to come to the floor, that actually shrunk government spending, didn't just keep it rolling along at the previous year's levels. Although we had to do that a couple of times simply to get to the point where we could get him to the negotiating table. And we did. Within 2.5 years, in the Balanced Budget Act of 1997, which also cut taxes and reformed welfare, we balanced the budget. And it wasn't simply what a lot of folks in Washington like to call, cut in spending, which is simply a reduction in increases in spending. This was a real balanced budget. Now, unfortunately, it only lasted for a few years. And the folks in Washington, after Bush came in, went through the roof again. But this notion that we can't balance the budget without a constitutional amendment just is not true. We can. Ultimately, the power resides where? It resides here, we the people. If we demand and hold these folks' feet to the fire, that they do that they not allow a single, for example, of Barack Obama's spending measures that he wants to come to the floor of the House, he will have to, at some point, negotiate. And that is, also, as Barry did say correctly, Congress also does have the power through the appropriations process to stop funding for any particular program. Maybe it's just an executive order, one of many that this president has signed, that violate separation of powers, for example. Congress can attach to what generally they do is attach a rider to a spending bill that the president needs. Let's say the funding of the appropriations for the funding of the White House. The press people and all of those characters. The president really wants to have that. He has to have that. Can't pay anybody on the White House staff without it. So you attach that rider to that spending bill. No funds appropriated under this legislation, under this law. shall be used for, and then you basically just sort of fill in the blank. And it can be something very broad, it can be something very narrow. Now, with Harry Reid, also known as the Undertaker over in the Senate, the man who never smiles, with Harry Reid over in the Senate, we know to an absolute certainty, as anything is certain in politics, is that Harry Reid will do what this president wants him to do. So we passed, let's say we passed through the House an appropriations bill, a must-have bill that the White House wants, and we attach a rider to it that stops the president from implementing a particularly offensive, unconstitutional, illegal executive order. Now, the president has two options. These are the only two options he has. He can go to Harry Reid and say, Harry, they got me on this one. I've got to have this bill. Even though I don't like that rider on there, this spending bill is just too important. I've got to have it, so let it come to the floor even with that limitation in it. Now, we know what this administration will do. They try and find some other way to get around the Constitution. But you got to stop them at every step of the way whenever you can. It's the only way you teach them a lesson. It's the only way you get results. Or, the president can say, I've got to have that spending bill, but I can't live with the, what they put in there. So let's negotiate. It forces him to the negotiating table. All of that is repeated over and over and over again. It happens an awful lot. It happens not just during the budget cycle, but throughout the year. Because there are supplemental spending bills that are constantly going from the Congress to the White House. Every one of those is a vehicle that can be used. Congress has the backbone, the wherewithal, the intelligence, and the stick-to-itiveness to do what we can, to do everything we can to stop what this president is doing. Now, ultimately, if all that fails, and as Barry mentioned, we did have a discussion about this in the forum the other night. We can, and I advocate, as I did back in 1997, based on what we then knew about the illegal monies coming in from foreign countries, coming into the White House, for example, in the 1996 campaign, not just from any foreign country, but Communist China. And national security information going over to the Chinese. Very, very serious offenses that we had evidence of. I call for what's called an inquiry of impeachment. That is a responsible step that the Congress should take when there is evidence that a president is violating the law. Now, it doesn't jump, what do they say, jump the shark. It doesn't jump to articles of impeachment. But it does say there's sufficient evidence here that the president is violating the laws and committing, in the words of the Constitution, high crimes and misdemeanors, to the degree that Congress needs to look into it. And that vests in the Judiciary Committee, which I will plan to go back and serve with the 8 years of seniority that I had previously on that committee. That vests in the Judiciary Committee the responsibility, the power, as it were, to inquire into whether or not there is evidence sufficient to recommend to the full House articles of impeachment. So it's a standard process, and it's a responsible one. And what we've seen in recent years and continuing, virtually to this day with this administration is, and Barry is correct on this as well, an utter, flagrant, deliberate violation of not just the constitutional framework of our country, the separation of powers, perhaps most importantly, but also specific laws. Even some laws that this administration wanted and encouraged the Congress to pass. And we see what is happening with regard to the immigration scandal. That is, in this administration, every time you think, darn, they can't do anything worse than they're doing. They fool us. They turn around and say, we got you, we did. What they're doing now with deliberately instructing our Border Patrol and the immigration enforcement not to refuse entry to all of these women and children. And these aren't just babes in arms that we're talking about here. What we're talking about also are teenagers trained in murder, through MR-13, one of the most notorious violence-oriented gangs in Mexico and Central America. A lot of these kids, they're finding, have tattoos. You know, these gangs, they love the tattoos, the MR-13 in particular. And these kids are coming across, and our Border Patrol has been instructed to let them come in, ostensibly for humanitarian reasons. I don't know what humanitarian reason there is to allow very clear gang members to come into your country and then be dispersed around the country, which is what this administration is doing. They're squandering our national security resources by housing these people at our military bases, and then they're dispersing them around the country. That certainly warrants an inquiry into whether or not that is lawful and constitutional, which I don't think that it is. But,
Bob, can I back up a second?
sure.
Regarding the budget, the House taking action to restrict, bring the budget into line. You talked at length about that. You said the House has the power. The House can do this. You said it more than once. And right now we have leadership of the House as a topic of discussion. So why hasn't that been happening in the House?
It's a good question.
In the past
And
5,
one of
6
the first
years.
things I intend to find out when I get back up there, because it is a very serious lack of something in the House.
And do you see some needed change in the leadership in the House there as a result of this?
So we need some change all the way down the line. We had earlier this year we had Tom DeLay in town. Tom was when I served in the House, he was the majority whip and later the majority leader in the House. And but for a rogue prosecutor in Texas misusing the grand jury system in that state repeatedly over and over and over again to try and push a grand jury. I think he went through 6 grand juries. And right before, literally I think within days, if not a day, the statute of limitations expiring on the state charges that he wanted to bring against Tom DeLay, he finally got a grand jury to agree with him. Now, many years later, Tom was exonerated, but when Tom was here in earlier this year, we talked with him about that because Tom is not wishy-washy. He's not a wallflower. He's tough as nails. They called him the hammer for a reason. He knew how to get things done up there, and he led the effort, to marshal the votes on the floor and keep this together. Newt did a lot also. Because in our caucuses back during the initial so-called government shutdown, 1995, 1996, which wasn't a shutdown at all, any more than the one last fall was a shutdown. It simply was a temporary curtailment of non-essential government services, which raises the obvious question, well, if they're non-essential, what are we paying for them in the first place? But what we did back then is Newt reminded us that our goal, here again, our goal was not to beat Clinton on this spending bill. It wasn't to beat him in this session of the Congress. It was to accomplish long-term good, constitutional good for the country, to get us back on a sound fiscal track. So we had that long-term vision, and we had leadership and a team that understood that's the ultimate goal. And we got there in 2.5 years, which is absolutely amazing. And one of the tools that we used was simply stopping Clinton's spending bills from coming to the floor. We need to do it again.
Walt has a question over there.
I have 2 questions for you raised before Barry. One, as I said, asked him before, the next Congress will be facing the national debt limit again. What will be your position on that? And also, that's the same question someone else asked again. Why are you running for Congress?
I'm running for Congress because I know, having been there, that we can do better. We can do better. We can get this country back in fiscal shape. We can rebuild our nation's defenses. And it distresses me greatly to see a government, even though we control only sort of one of the three major components of the government, leaving the court system aside for a minute, the House, the Senate, and the executive, the president, even though we control only one, it is, in many senses, the most powerful one, if we choose to exercise that power. As U.S. Attorney under President Reagan, that's what I did within a much smaller jurisdiction of being a U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. Know what the tools are and use them. There's no reason at all why we shouldn't be using those tools. I know we can do better. We can accomplish great things again. That's why I'm running.
What about debt ceiling?
Pardon?
The debt ceiling. The Congress is going to have to vote on raising the debt ceiling.
Oh, yeah. Raising the debt ceiling is, to me, a non-starter. That's part of what's gotten us into this trouble in the first place. Now, are there some scenarios in which we can more than offset certain things? But just raising the debt ceiling, non-starter.
Is there any spending in the late 90s that you think we cut too much? For instance, military.
Well, Clinton did, and we went along sometimes with that. The one thing Clinton was able to tout over and over and over again was he cut the positions and he cut certain spending. Well, yeah, a lot of it was through the BRAC process, for example, and other cuts in the military personnel. Yes, we did cut too much. This BRAC thing is kind of interesting. The Base Realignment and Closure Commission, that's what the BRAC stands for. Yeah, it's absolutely bizarre when you think about it. What is the most important fundamental responsibility of the government? To defend the nation. Yet what is the one area in which we have made it the easiest to cut government spending? National defense. I mean, what we really need is a social program. Realignment and Closure Commission. That's what we really need. Would that be SPRAC or?
We'll work on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I asked in the telephone conversation tonight, mentioned the statements you had to come up with here, and just briefly, what's your position, your thinking on an Article 5 convention?
I'm not in the same camp as George Soros. George Soros wants an Article 5 convention, constitutional convention. I don't. I have I am in awe of the Constitution. It is the greatest document written by the hand of man. The Bible was written by the hand of God. The greatest document to me written by the hand of man is the U.S. Constitution. We don't need, now granted, I said earlier, if we can get some of these amendments through, maybe that'll help. But we don't need to open up the Constitution of the United States to whatever George Soros and his folks in other states. I mean, we're fine here in Georgia, perhaps, to open it up. The tools are there. They're in the Constitution. We don't need more tools. We simply need the wherewithal, the backbone, and the stick-to-itiveness as a citizenry and to demand our public officials use the tools that are already there in the Constitution. I see no reason whatsoever to open that can of worms.
I agree with that.
Oh, excuse me, let me turn that on. It's a great song.
You are on this. Professor Barr? Professor Barr?
You better call out that tonight.
I saw him. Okay, then Mark.
Okay, quick question. Mr. Loudermilk raised an issue I hadn't thought much about, which is impeachment at the judiciary, and I assume that was in reference probably to Justice Roberts and what happened on the Supreme Court with the ACA. What would you see as the dangers and or the benefits of a judicial impeachment at the Supreme Court level?
There are two primary ways to attack the judicial activism or judicial stupidity sometimes that we see. One is Congress has the ultimate power to limit the jurisdiction of the federal courts. And Tom DeLay, I mean to pick on Tom DeLay, but I do it in a positive way. Tom DeLay pushed legislation when he was in the House as Majority Whip and Majority Leader to limit the jurisdiction of the federal courts to assume jurisdiction, to take jurisdiction over certain cases that we believe they don't have any business in. These are decisions that the people make or the states make. Congress can do that. Now, it's very difficult because, of course, it's not a constitutional amendment. It's a constitutional power that Congress has, but it can be done just by legislation. Very difficult given the makeup of the three entities right now, certainly, but that's one way to do it. I have absolutely no problem at all holding a Supreme Court justice, as great and powerful as they are once they don those black robes, holding them to the same constitutional principles that a president, an attorney general, or any other high official is held to. So I think it's worth thinking about.
Okay, can you answer Mark back there real quick? We're just about out of time.
Oh, can I be quick? First of all, I was a fan of the '94 Congress with Nuge and yourself and the Contractors of America, and I think Bill Clinton was the most Republican president we've had since Reagan. And he also did social welfare with the welfare reform, which is outstanding. It was a great time for you folks, and I applaud you for that. And that's the reason for my question, was that was the first balanced budget we've had in forever, and the last one, I might add. But someone once told me that you folks did this with somewhat of an accounting trick where you moved Social Security from a liability on the federal books to an asset on the federal books. And since you were there, and I've only sort of got this, it's hard to verify that. Can you tell me if that's true and if there's any accounting tricks that were in fact used to get to that balanced budget?
First of all, I find it absolutely unbelievable that any time in the Congress would use accounting tricks to make their budgets better. For sure, I've heard of that.
Right.
I'm
Social
trying
Security
to
is
make,
such a small liability too. I mean, what's the difference, right?
yeah. No, I mean, it was a straight balanced budget. That's all that it was. And one of the ways, one of the components of that was to do what this administration, I think, knows in its heart is the right thing to do, but will not do because they don't want to cut taxes, is we cut taxes. No, not as much as we like, but that hastened the arrival of that balanced budget.
Most of this audience are well versed with the Lafayette curve and believe lowering taxes would increase revenue. So we're with you on that platform.
Yeah, very
Thank you for answering that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.